G'day. This video covers a work Parti-gyle example of an actual John Groves of Weymouth 1933 Parti-gyle of K-ale and Pale Ale, using Brewfather for the recipe design. This 20th century form of Parti-gyle is not that of multiple mashes with each mash producing a separate beer, but of multiple mashes of the same mash with post-boil blending to produce multiple beers. My book Guile Brews has many examples of Parti-gyles, and the link is in the description below. The whole idea of Parti-gyling tends to frighten and intimidate some brewers, and my aim here is to provide an how-to guide in the design of a Parti-gyle based on the original source brewing record using Brewfather. This example is relatively straightforward to show the principles and the method. In this video, I will cover the key definitions, the deciphering of the brewing book, process and planning, and the recipe design. Now, Brewfather does not automatically cater for Parti-gyles. However, this talk will describe a method on how it can be used. Today, guile is commonly spelt guile with a Y, which is a term widely used in the old brewing books related to beer production, in effect identifying each batch brewed. A Parti-gyle is a method of producing multiple gyles, batches or beers from the one mash. And for the absence of doubt, copper equals kettle, kettle equals copper. All the screen captures were version 276. So as Parti-gyling deals with mashing, it's not really suitable for extract brewers. Next, I'm going to cover some archaic brewing measurement terms. The circular nomograph is from the inside cover of a 1909 Cooper's brewing book. That's Cooper's as in Australian sparkling ale. Barrels are imperial of 36 gallons, and pounds per barrel was a much used measurement of gravity for the 19th and much of the 20th century. Quarters and bushels. Volumetric measurements, 8 bushels to a quarter. Now the weight of a bushel varied on depending what was being weighed, and custom and practice varied by region or country. But a buyer knew what to expect, and the seller knew what to provide in terms of weight from a bushel. A UK quarter of base malt was nominally 336 pounds, whereas an Australian quarter was 320 pounds. And hundredweights in this recreation are all 112 pounds. Now, the other thing you have to deal with is having to convert all of these archaic measurements into specific gravities, from imperial pounds per barrel to grams per litre, F to C and C to F, and degrees Réaumur and all that good stuff. Degrees Balling or Plato. Now, practical brewers, we multiplied by 4 to get these numbers, and it's probably good enough. The ABV measurements were based on the UK excise notice, and your mileage may vary on those. But I put all of these into a spreadsheet, and I've got a link below. The other tool is the blending calculator, and we'll see more of this one later on. And a link to the blending calculator is also in the comments below. This is a simplified 20th century traditional Parti-gyle, and the plant used in this example was 1 mash tun with 1 copper 2 mashes were done and were sent sequentially to the copper, boiled as the first copper and then the second copper. Then the outputs of these 2 coppers were blended into the 2 fermentation vessels. This produces 2 beers from the 1 mash and was fairly typical for a smaller brewery. I found no evidence in the brewing records of capping the mash, which seems to be a home brewing practice. So there's a very impressive facade at Weymouth. This was taken in 2018. John Groves rebuilt the brewery in 1904. It closed when it was amalgamated with J.A. Devonish, who were next door, and finally the whole Devonish site was closed in 1985. The beers we're going to cover today are from 1933, 16th of January, for K and Pale Ale. Now, K, which is what it was called in the brewery, was probably sold as the light dinner ale. And on the face of it, these were very similar beers. The Pale Ale probably drank a little fuller than the K and may have been primed a little differently. The IPA seems to be an intermediate beer between K and Pale Ale. This shows how party-gyling was a way to expand a range of beers, with the subtlety being in the use of different sugars and hops in each copper and the subsequent blending to produce unique beers. This simple example will deal with K and Pale Ale to explain the principles behind party-gyling. So let's have a look at the materials used from the brewing record. Under malt, JG Best Old, Best New Malt, probably domestic barley. They had their own maltings next to the brewery, and with the port of Weymouth only being a block or so away, importing foreign grains would not have been a problem. Hence the Turkish and Californian, which I would assume to be 6-row. BS1, number 1 invert sugar. You can see there were different amounts added to the coppers, and some malt extract. For the hops, we have the grower names. They may have been growers, they may have been hop factors, and we can see the allocations of different hops to each of the coppers. We can see that they're all Worcestershire, and I've taken Worcestershire in this case to mean Fuggles. Now let's look at the copper hops. Brewing records that I've seen rarely detail the addition times for the hops. This was very much tacit knowledge within the brewery. Where I did find the timing was a 1906 record, and they probably hadn't changed their practice very much in 25 years due to the brewers' conservatism and no investment in new brewing plant. Now, several texts of the day stated that hops were added in proportion to the gravity of the copper. The hopping proportion here are also roughly in line with the gravity of each copper. For the recreation recipe, the hopping rate was derived from the pounds per barrel per copper, converted to grams per litre, and then discounted for the particular period. Whole hops were converted to pellets, and allowances made for the age of the hops, the use of seeded hops, and cold storage. Converted all of these to Fuggle. The use of Goldings would also be reasonable for the later additions and possibly the dry hopping. In the recreation recipe, I reduced the boil to 70 minutes rather than 2 hours and maintained the estimated IBU for each addition. So this was very much a single infusion mash with a 120-minute boil. Now the hopback was interesting because hops retain a lot of valuable wort, and they used hop sparge in the blend. I have seen some John Groves records where more hops were added to the hopback, giving the equivalent of a modern day hop stand. Next is the blending. So there were 81 barrels produced from copper 1 at 19 pounds per barrel, 1053, and from copper 2, 84 barrels at 11.2, 1031. To make the pale ale, which was Guile 1, some liquor was added, giving a 1042 blend. For the K ale, some hop sparge was added as well, which had some gravity remaining, and this creates the two beers from the one mash. Now we come to the fermentation. Pale ale was pitched at 16, K at 17. Profiles were quite similar. The K was fermented a little bit cooler than the pale ale, which rose up to 22. The primary fermentation was all done in 3 days. Conditioned for 4 days at 16C. Was racked after 7 days with the pale ale at 1011 and the K at 1009. Now as to the colour, the record stated that colours were added to the natural colour. The pale ale was slightly darker than the K ale. There were numbers there, but I can't really assume that they were Lovibond or SRM. But relatively, the pale ale was tinted, probably with liquid caramel, to be darker than the K. Having described the historic brews, it's time to consider how this will translate to your system. And these factors will likely be very specific to your system. HLT capacity, size of your mash tun, mashing efficiency, amount you can boil in the copper, your boil off rate, how many fermenters you've got. And I'd like to stress that it's really handy to know the capacity of your vessels and that everything that you're using to measure with is properly calibrated. Now, I've not suggested any particular brewing system. My 3-vessel system has maximum capacity of 60 litres for the hot liquor tank, the mash tun and the copper, and I have 2 35-litre fermentation vessels. Now here we have the specification. So what we're aiming to produce is 21 litres each of pale ale at 1042 and K ale at 1034. So the master batch comes out to be 42 litres at 1040. Now this particular Parti-gyle is designed for a 50-50 split by volume from the mash. From experience, I get around 63% of the extract from half of the mash volume. I think a reasonable rule of thumb is that a 60-40 split of the extract from the mash without sparging the first mash could be expected. The boil has the reference parameters for boiling each of the coppers. And what we're looking for is the post-boil 20 litres 1053 and 20 litres of 1031. So we look at the master batch parameters based on 75% mash efficiency. And I've used the Brewing water pale ale profile. And I've entered that into Brewfather and then use the Brewfather water calculator. The grist for mashing is very straightforward. It is hard to get 6 row, I've used Castle 2-row Pilsner malt, or use a less biscuity malt for the 6-row. Something with a bit of graininess to it. First mash 65 degrees with a mash out, and then a remash at 68 degrees. So the first boil, copper 1, 70 minutes. Now that's got invert sugar and dry light malt extract, added 15 minutes before the end of the boil. And because your alpha of your fuggles will vary, I have used the IBU numbers. And then similarly for the second copper, which only has invert sugar added and a different hopping rate. Now to find out how to make invert sugar in a Thermomix, you can see the link below. Right, now here's the plan. What we've got to do is to produce 2 wort streams, one from the first mash and one from the second remash. For the first mash, strike of 28 litres followed up by a 6 litre mash out, which effectively replaces the liquid absorbed by the grains. Or if you have the ability to step mash, then you could add all 34 litres at the beginning and ramp it up to 77. This is no sparge. Have a look in page 160 of Guile Brews for more details. Copper 1 has sugar and dry malt extract added, total of 10-12 SG. We boil for 70 minutes. You boil off 6 litres, 2 litres of losses due to trube, cooling, etc. And the plan is to get 20 litres of 1053. The second mash or remash is effectively a sparge of the grains. So because we've already accommodated the losses, the 28 litres of sparge effectively flows through into the copper. Similarly, we add some number 1 invert, we have the same sort of boil off, and we end up with 20 litres at 1031. That's the plan. Next, the Brewfather recipe design. Now the methodology that I'm using here is similar to what I used to use with ProMash. Yes, I am that old. But this version's specific to Brewfather. So I've created a template in Brewfather, which is the master Parti-gyle. Now within this template, it's got all the system and equipment specific information for the way you like to brew. So in this particular template, as we shall see, it includes all the fermentables to brew both beers. Perhaps the best way of thinking about it is that you're going to create 4 separate beers. So from the master, we're going to create Parti-gyle Copper 1. Then we're going to duplicate it and modify it to be Parti-gyle Copper 2. So there's 2 beers. Then we're going to take the outputs of those 2 recipes and put them into the blending spreadsheet, details of which are below. And then we end up with PG Beer 1 and PG Beer 2, which is an edited version of Beer 1. We then create a batch to ferment Beer 1 and another batch to ferment Beer 2. Right, so this is the master Parti-gyle template, and it includes all of my standard system settings, all the fermentables, hops and yeast, plus the miscellaneous items, and it's set for a batch size of 42 litres. you will need to adjust for your particular system, of course. So you enter all the fermentables per the recipe. Now I substituted Voyager Pale Schooner malt instead of the 6-row pills. You don't really need to worry about adding the hop quantities and timings at this stage. This recipe has all the malts and sugars in the correct percentages to give 42 litres at 1044. Now that's rounded up a bit as a safety margin in case you don't quite get the amount of extract that you were expecting. And it also includes all the hop types for copper 1 and 2. So again, the expectation for my system using a 50-50 volume split that the no sparge mash will yield about 63% of the extract and the sparge remash about 37%, and your system and methods will vary. So here you can see all the standard miscellaneous items that I have in my master template. So I chose an English strain, WLP 002 from White Labs, to go in my master. And of course you can always change the yeast type in the blended beer, Parti-gyle beer 1 and 2 later on. Note that I have removed the sparging step from the mash profile, as this will be a no sparge for Parti-gyle Copper 1, so as to leave enough residual sugars for the Parti-gyle Copper 2 sparge remash. Now once you've checked everything, you need to duplicate this master template recipe and rename it to Parti-gyle Copper 1. Now if you look in the bottom right hand corner, there are 3 dots. You click on the 3 dots, it then brings up the menu, and then you hit duplicate to be able to duplicate the recipe. In a similar way, you can duplicate a batch. Now we're in the copied Copper 1 recipe. So you change the batch volume to 21 litres, but you don't scale. You enter in the fermentables, hops, mash, temperatures, etc. per the recipe. See page 159 of Guile Brews. Again, this is an apportionment of the mash extract into the first copper. The program gives an estimate of the color, and it also gives an estimate of the IBUs using the Tinseth formula. Both of these numbers are used in the blending calculation. So here we adjust the water profile to suit the 34 litres. And now we have Parti-gyle Copper 1 has all the mashing details, all the sugar and the hop additions, and the expected post boil should be 21 litres with a specific gravity of 1056. We're not really interested in the fermentation details at this stage, and once you've checked everything, duplicate Parti-gyle Copper 1 and rename it to Parti-gyle Copper 2. So the second copper is to provide 28 litres, 30% of the total mash extract, plus the number 1 invert. So you change, again, the fermentables and hops per the recipe. And we get an estimate of the color and the IBUs, again, which we're going to use in the blending calculator. So now we adjust the sparge water pH to suit the 28 litres of sparge water, adjust the sparge remash temperature to 68 degrees, And now that completes the recipe. So you record your actual gravities and volumes that you achieve from copper 1 and 2, and then we can move to the blending. Now we get to the blending, and I'd like to stress that your actual measured values should be used. This spreadsheet has the actual values based on 20 litres of 1056 and 20 litres of 1032. The blue squares are where you enter the data along with the volumes that you want for your blend. In this particular instance, there were a little bit of hop spirits used, hence the different gravity. We also enter in the colour and IBU calculated for each of the coppers from the recipe design, and that will vary depending on how you do the blend mix. That'll give us an estimated IBU and EBC for beer 1, which is the pale ale, and beer 2, which is the K ale. I've tried to keep the proportions of copper 1 and copper 2 about the same as the original log, but there was a lot more pale ale produced than K. Your volumes and gravities will differ. Just try and keep the same relative proportions of work from copper 1 and copper 2. It's your choice whether to dilute or not, or to choose a different blend, and one alternative blend is next. So one of the blending options available would be to produce the special pale ale, which was of a stronger gravity, well, 1047, best bitter strength, and some more K ale. From my research, a good proportion of the stronger copper 1 wort should always be used in all blends, otherwise you get thinness. Now you have the blends, you can now set up your recipes and batches for beer 1 and beer 2 in Brewfather. Now what we need to do next is to create a new recipe called Parti-gyle beer 1, and you change the type to extract. In the equipment profile, we set the fermenter batch size to the volume that we had for the blend, which was 24 litres. Now go to inventory and create something called extract of blend. In effect, it's a dummy original gravity and estimated final gravity of 1011 that you want to create in this fermentable. And under hops in inventory, create dummy, and dummy has 10% alpha, and you set the IBU to the calculated blend, which in this case was 35 IBU. Now we add a kilogram of extract of blend to Parti-gyle beer 1 recipe, set the OG to 1042, the colour to 10 EBC, which also matches the blend calculation and scale. Now it should look something like this. So you select your fermentation profile and yeast. You can adjust your dry hopping here. I've given you different rates for the different beers. And put in any miscellaneous items like biofine clear that you use. Now PG beer 1, the pale ale, should be ready for fermentation. Now duplicate beer 1 and rename it to beer 2. Adjust the volume to 21.5 litres to match the blend volumes along with the original gravity and the colour, and dry hopping as you like. You could of course use a different yeast. Check your attenuation and fermentation profile, select the beer mug icon and create a batch for Parti-gyle beer 2 and also a batch for Parti-gyle Beer 1. So moving to Parti-gyle Beer 1, we need just to complete the setup. We change the status to fermenting, allocate any devices you might like to use, like an ice spindle or a brew pile S, and then you change Parti-gyle Beer 2, the K ale, to fermenting in a similar fashion to Beer 1, and you're done. You just need to wait for the beers to ferment. Now, you have a model system that you can adapt to your system. You have a recipe design process. You have sample recipes. Now you can give parti-gyling a go. The example provided is relatively simple in order to show the principles and application. Lots more information about parti-gyles in Guile Brews, and the link is below. Thanks for watching. My books, Bronze Brews, 6 O'Clock Brews and Guile Brews, are all available as print on demand from Lulu. Bronze Brews has lots of recreated recipes from Tooths and Tuies. 6 O'Clock Brews has a lot from Cooper's. I'm still looking for original brewing records. If you have some, please get in touch. Hit subscribe for future tips on recreating old beers. Cheers.